Today is Thursday, February the 24th, 2022. Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Religion in 60 Minutes. I'm Charles Powell, faculty at the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. Our panel today is titled, Our Shared Paths to Justice, Learning from Desmond Tutu's Faith and Activism. Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu left us with an inspiring legacy on how to champion human dignity. Today, we will explore his faith-inspired activism for racial justice, interfaith solidarity, anti-militarism, and just peace. This panel is brought to you by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion and co-sponsored by the University of Notre Dame's African Student Association, the Keough Center for Civil and Human Rights, and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. I encourage you to check out the good and worthwhile work they are engaged in locally and globally. I was sitting in the lobby of a hotel in Knoxville, Tennessee, when I picked up a copy of USA Today, the very one that I'm holding in my hands, and I saw on the front page that a great man had passed away. The headline read, Desmond Tutu, fighter for equality, dies at 90. I did not know the Archbishop personally, but I came to appreciate and respect his work when I was pursuing my ecumenical doctorate of ministry degree at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Another great man passed away last year. My former professor and faculty reader on my dissertation committee, Professor and Father Robert Schreider. Father Schreider introduced me to interreligious dialogue. Consequently, the writings and activities of Desmond Tutu. And Father Schreider fostered within me a real sense of passion for this discipline. Father Schreider explained his personal mission and ministry this way. He said, peacebuilding is arduous and often frustrating work, since there are many setbacks and many disappointments. What has come about in recent years is a growing awareness of how important the role of faith is in this work. Moreover, Father Schreider said the work is exhilarating because one feels that such things help make a difference in the world. He went on to say, as we learn in our faith, it is not my work, but God's. A ministry of reconciliation flows directly from our precious blood spirituality, and I have been happy to be part of this. May both of these very spiritual and influential men rest in peace and enjoy the everlasting sanctuary of heaven they both believed in so dearly. Desmond Tutu, the great Archbishop of South Africa, a great country where diverse people unite, a country rich in diversity, a country known for breathtaking beaches, a country rich in culture and people, a country known for superb food and delicious wine, a land that is home to elephants and buffaloes and rhinos, lions and leopards, a place where the weather is almost perfect, South Africa, a land that Desmond Tutu loved, moreover, a people that he saw as beautiful, people, both victims and villains, who needed to hear good news that people can be free, good news that people can be forgiven, good news that some wrongs can be made right, good news that people can get the health care they need, good news that Black is beautiful, good news that hatred between whites and Blacks does not have to be the norm, good news that South Africans can own their rich culture and be proud of the accomplishments made and the victories to come. Desmond Tutu, a man loved by people of goodwill, but a man that was feared by those who sought to oppress and rob the good people of South Africa of their human dignity. Today, I am so pleased to be joined by three wonderful human beings. We will be in conversation with the Dean of King's College London, Dr. Ellen Clark-Keene. Dr. Clark-Keene, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Charles. It's great to be here on a sunny London evening.
Next, I'm joined by Mediation Program Director and Professor of the Practice of Mediation at the Keough School of Global Affairs, Dr. Laurie Nathan. Professor Nathan, welcome to the conversation.
Charles, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I am in a hotel room in New York. I can't tell you what the weather's like outside since I haven't been out this morning yet.
And I'm also glad to be joined by Associate Teaching Professor of Islamic Studies and Peacebuilding, Imam and Dr. A. Rashied Omar. Imam Omar, welcome to the conversation. All three of my panelists knew Desmond Tutu and collaborated with him on matters of momentous importance. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, audience, for joining us on Zoom. You will have time at the end of the conversation to ask some questions of these esteemed panelists. I invite you to send me your questions in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screen. By way of introduction, I want to invite Ellen, the Dean of King's College London, to tell us a bit about herself and how did you come to know South African Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu?
Well, the very first time I met Desmond Tutu was about 35 years ago when he was leading a youth pilgrimage in Portsmouth in England. And the first time I saw him was very typical for him. He was eating an ice cream cone in the street with great relish. I met him again when I was chaplain at Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge, and we gave Desmond Tutu an honorary fellowship there in 1999. His presence there was a delight to the whole college. And again, very typically, I remember how warmly and lovingly he thanked our student choir when they sang Nkosi Sikelele Africa for him. And now it's my great honor to be Dean of King's College London, where the Arch, as he's affectionately known, studied theology at undergraduate and at postgraduate level in the early 1960s, and was made a fellow here in the 2000s. We used to have a bar at King's named the Tutu Bar in honor of one of our greatest and most beloved alumni. And in addition, I feel like I've known of him all my life. The small, passionate Archbishop, unafraid to speak truth to power, adept at using his own position to push for change and for justice, joyful as well as open with his tears, wanting to see barriers broken down wherever he encountered them, apartheid fundamentally, but also between faiths and within faiths for LGBTQ people. He has been all my life a beacon of God's challenging, joyful, justice-oriented, inclusive, and mischievous spirit.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure we could have a whole panel discussion on the Tutu Bar. So thank you for sharing that bit of information with us. What a dynamic man and what an incredible relationship you had with him. Professor Nathan, you are South African. You had the opportunity to get to know him in difficult times. Can you speak a bit about yourself and how you came to know the Arch?
Yeah, you know, the Arch was the epitome of a great man, a great person. And one felt that immediately in his presence, whether it was a personal, intimate interaction or watching him on a public platform or leading a march of anti-apartheid demonstrators in Cape Town with the riot police, as they were called in those days, lined up against us, threatening batons, threatening to charge us, threatening arrests, and threatening tear gas and rubber bullets. I was involved as a student activist from the early 1980s in the struggle against apartheid, and the Archbishop was one of our heroes and one of our leaders. More specifically, I was a founder member of the End Conscription campaign, which was an anti-apartheid movement fighting against a system of conscription into the apartheid army. The conscription applied only to white men, so we were being called on to be instruments of force in defending a system of minority rule. And we looked to the archbishop as one of the leaders of our movement. That was in part because of his status as a senior religious leader, but also because of his enormous moral courage, his ability to speak truth to power, and this phenomenal sense of humor. I mean, even in the most dire circumstances, the Arch was cracking jokes about himself at his own expense. He was cracking jokes about apartheid. And despite the fact that his opposition to apartheid was emphatic and implacable, he had the grace to look for reconciliation even in those days, to look for love even in those days, to look for mercy and reconciliation even in those incredibly difficult days. So he was a phenomenal inspiration.
Thank you, Laurie. I have heard similar stories from others. Thank you for sharing that. And in just a few moments, Laurie will be speaking more to this important topic about ending and his involvement in ending conscription, the conscription campaign. So that will be coming up in just a few moments. And then again, my other panelist today is Professor Omar. So good to see you and welcome to the conversation. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to know the Arch. I've seen some fabulous pictures of you and the Arch together, one where it looks like you're even holding his arm. So this is a very unique encounter that you had, you being a Muslim and him being an Anglican priest. So tell us a little bit about this.
Thank you, Charles. Yes, I was appointed as an imam of a prominent anti-apartheid mosque congregation in Cape Town in 1986. In fact, in the same year that Father Desmond Tutu was appointed as the first Black Archbishop, Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town. So the Arch's appointment as Archbishop, Tutu's appointment as Archbishop of Cape Town, meant that he had to move from Johannesburg to a designated residence known as Bishop's Court. Now, the Claremont Maynard Mosque, where I served as Imam, was situated fortuitously within a mile from Bishop's Court. And so, in the late 1980s, as a young Imam at the Claremont Maynard Mosque, and my predecessor, Imam Hassan Solomons, have been very much involved in the formation of the United Democratic Front and at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle. I had the privilege, after having taken over from Imam Hassan, of being invited by Archbishop Tutu to attend several consultative meetings at Bishop's Court, where we would strategize about our anti-apartheid protest marches and other anti-apartheid racial justice campaigns. So it was at these interfaith forums that I had the good fortune of actually meeting Archbishop Tutu and being inspired by his social justice witness. But after having served as Archbishop of Cape Town from 1986 to 1994, the Archbishop retired and then decided to continue living in the city of Cape Town, which was again fortuitous for me. Since the next 3 decades of his life, he lived in the city of Cape Town, and I had then several opportunities of again meeting and interacting with him. And I remember on one occasion he had been invited for dinner by one of the Claremont Maynard Masjid congregants, and we had a sumptuous meal together with his wife, Mama Leah Tutu, and some of his children. And at that occasion, the Archbishop fondly referred to me as his Muslim son, which is really moving for me.
Beautiful story. Thank you for sharing, and you'll be going into more detail soon as to the work that you did with him, how he influenced your life in so many ways. Ellen, you recently returned from South Africa. You attended Desmond's funeral and consequently represented King's College London at the funeral. Can you take a few moments, describe the mood? Who were some of the keynote speakers? What particular themes emerged during this service? In your mind, was it an interfaith fellowship?
Thank you. It was an incredible honor to represent King's at the Arch's funeral. I've got the funeral booklet just here. And with Omicron at its peak, there are only 100 of us allowed to attend, some invited by the family, some by the church, and some by the state. And I think this sort of small number made the mood very quiet and reflective, especially as the choir were actually singing in a different room and only present with us on video. The service was primarily in English, but there were readings in isiXhosa and Afrikaans. Naomi Tutu spoke of the Arch as a father and husband. Archbishop Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, sent a greeting by video, and Michael Nuttall, who was the retired Bishop of Natal, preached. And he talked both of how important it had been for him as a white priest and bishop to be seen as Tutu's subordinate partner, and also about how Tutu lived out the prophet Micah's calling to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Most of the sort of service was religious. Right at the end of the service, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, spoke of the significance of the Arch as South Africa's real spiritual leader. And he was honest about the way that Tutu had criticized the ANC and called them to repent of their own corruption and injustices. And he reflected movingly on the way that the Arch sort of carried the pain of the nation through the truth and the reconciliation hearings. I think the most moving moment for me was right at the end of the service, when the Arch's very small, very plain coffin was processed down the aisle and out of the cathedral. He had asked for the cheapest coffin available, as he didn't want his funeral to be an occasion of pomp. And as it left, I felt a real sense of personal and sort of worldwide loss for such a great-hearted priest and leader, and a real need for those of us left behind to step up to continue the work that Tutu had begun. I was actually surprised, you asked about the interfaith elements, I was surprised at how Anglican a service it actually was. It felt very sort of rooted in the cathedral, in the family, and very much a sort of a familial service, rooted more in Tutu's identity as an Anglican bishop rather than as a champion of interfaith relationships. There had been a memorial event for family and friends just a couple of days before the funeral, and it was at that there were interfaith speakers, and there was a sort of celebration of that side of Tutu.
Thank you. I am so glad that you're here and you're able to bring to us these stories that are so fresh. It's good to hear how well people came together and really appreciated and respected his life, people from so many different walks of life. Professor Omar, you too enjoyed some very close encounters with the Archbishop. You've already mentioned a few of them. You recently wrote and published an article in the Cape Times titled Archbishop Tutu, a lifelong witness to human dignity, just peace, and interfaith solidarity. In that article, you are pictured standing very close to Desmond. You seem, as I mentioned earlier, you seem to be holding his arm. Both of you are smiling, perhaps engaged in friendly dialogue. It's a beautiful image. You said in that article, South Africa has a unique and unmatched interfaith and interreligious solidarity movement, thanks in large part and in large measure to the wise leadership and sterling contributions of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. Human dignity, social justice, interfaith solidarity. Unpack that for us. And we will need you to unmute.
Thank you, Charles. I want to start off with the picture that you mentioned. In that picture, the arch, as all of us would know, he has this very overwhelming and bubbly and infectious sense of humor. And so the photograph you referred to with the arch and myself is really special, and I think is emblematic of his bubbly and affable spirit that I really cherish. Let me, however, address your question more directly. Now, as is the case with most historical figures, who've lived such rich lives as the arch, it is inevitable that his legacy will be contested because it's so rich. But for me, one of the most significant dimensions of Archbishop Tutu's rich legacy, and it is inescapable, is his prophetic witness for social justice and human dignity, for oppressed and exploited people, not only in South Africa, but all over the world, and whichever denomination or nationality they would come from. It is therefore not surprising that this very critical dimension of Tutu's life and legacy is considered controversial, since many people do not regard the mixing of religion and politics, especially for a priest, to be correct. They would regard it as being taboo. So in his 2021 spiritual biography of Tutu, a book that I would strongly recommend for those interested in a deeper understanding of the life and legacy of Desmond Tutu, the author, Michael Battle, who's also an Anglican priest, here in the United States, shatters this false binary between the sacred and the secular. And he makes a compelling case that Tutu's social justice actions were not in spite of his deep spirituality, but rather because of it. Now, in this regard, I would call what I would call Tutu's social spirituality is modeled and embodied in a very important document produced by Black theologians in South Africa called the Kairos Document. And the Kairos Document was produced in 1985. And as I said, I think Tutu embodies this. The Kairos Document not only decried the racist and oppressive system of apartheid as a heresy, but provided South Africans with a crystallized articulation, or what I would call a South African variety of liberation theology, which emerged in Latin America. Now, the Kairos Document speaks about three kinds of theologies. State theology, in which a religion justifies the state. You can have a theocracy like you had in Iran, or in South Africa, which is not well known, is that the Dutch Reformed Church, in fact, legitimated the apartheid government. And then you have church theology, which is in fact very much in vogue everywhere, where religion turns a blind eye to issues of social justice. And then the third is prophetic theology, where religion has a profound prophetic witness for issues of social justice, which is very similar to what Pope Francis is doing these days. When he's speaking on issues of social justice, it creates some uncomfortableness with Catholics who may be having a church theology. So in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, as a Muslim, I became inspired and active in interfaith and interreligious activities, which had been, in fact, established by Archbishop Tutu. And he established an organization called the World Conference of Religions for Peace, South African chapter. And I'm a proud beneficiary of this rich and robust interfaith solidarity movement, which continues to exist in South Africa. And I believe that we are not merely honoring, but also giving profound thanks to the rich and diverse legacy bequeathed to us by Archbishop Tutu by continuing to build on this legacy.
Powerful. Imam Omar, I teach Muslim Christian dialogue, interreligious dialogue at Holy Cross College at Notre Dame. And many of my students often raise this fear that if they engage in interreligious dialogue, they are going to have to leave their faith at the door. But that was not your experience at all in your conversations and your dealings with Desmond. You were able to bring your whole self to the table, were you not?
Absolutely. And I think this is a kind of a counterintuitive reality, that if you learn about the religious traditions of other folks, you in fact become more rooted in your own tradition. It's like when I'm now in the United States, I learn more about my own city, Cape Town, when I'm outside of it, and I know more of what's happening than people living within the city. So it's a counterintuitive reality. And as we have heard, I mean, Tutu, one of his best friends was the Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist monk, the Dalai Lama. And he moved across so many religious traditions, but he remained, and his funeral epitomized that, you know, a profound and deeply rooted Anglican priest.
Thank you. Professor Nathan, you asked me to call you Laurie, so I'll call you Laurie. You knew the Arch in your capacity as a leader of the anti-apartheid in conscription campaign, something that you made reference to a few moments ago. In that capacity, you testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. In your words, tell us what was going on, why was it going on, what did you think should be going on? Moreover, what did you do to help end this conscription campaign?
We had in South Africa the particular problem of a white minority oppressing a black majority. And that meant that the white minority could prevail only through use of force. It didn't have the popular support of the demographic numbers to oppress 80% of the population. The apartheid regime therefore relied on its police force and on its military to suppress opposition to apartheid. The apartheid army occupied northern Namibia, a former South African colony, and occupied southern Angola because of the Angolan government's support for the Namibian struggle for independence. And when protest in black townships became especially militant in the mid-1980s, troops were deployed, apartheid troops were deployed even against our own people inside black townships. Who were these troops? These troops were me. These troops were my white brothers and cousins and friends. And so we were being expected to be complicit in apartheid, not only in a passive way, but in a very active way by holding a gun in defense of apartheid and by using those guns against our black brothers and sisters. So within the anti-apartheid movement, there were a small number of white people who said conscription provides an opportunity to mobilize other whites against apartheid. So we will see it as an opportunity, not only as a problem. It's an opportunity because asking young white men to pick up a rifle and use it in defense of apartheid is for many of them a step too far. And so the End Conscription campaign was born with the aim of mobilizing and organizing white people against apartheid around an issue that affected them directly and personally. And we were explicit in our aligning this campaign with the broader anti-apartheid struggle. We promoted the unbanning of the African National Congress, the Liberation Movement, which was then banned. We formed alliances with the United Democratic Front. At all our public meetings in Cape Town and elsewhere in the country, we had UDF leaders that were prominent. it was very important in the context of apartheid to make the point that white people per se were not the enemy. And Tutu wholeheartedly endorsed that position. The position of the liberation movement was one of commitment to what we called non-racialism. And the position of the ANC was, in essence, in that regard, we are being told by the apartheid regime that white and black people can't live together, that we have to necessarily segregate these different cultures. And that is not acceptable. From the position of the ANC, all of us, white and black, can unite against injustice and oppression. And for that message to take root, we had to see white people involved in the struggle against apartheid. And there weren't many of us, to be honest. So I don't want to overstate the number of white people involved in the struggle, but symbolically it was important. And the Arch saw this clearly. The first time I met him was at Bishop's Court. And this, you can't imagine this colonial mansion. This is the epitome of colonialism in South Africa, with a green lawn that just went on as far as you could see, with this 3-story grand building. And when I arrived at Bishop's Court, I was greeted by Mama Tutu, by Leah, and the Arch came down this grand staircase, joking with her. So they were sharing some joke with this booming voice and raucous laughter as I stood kind of watching the family interacting. And I invited the Arch to speak at one of our public rallies in Cape Town, which he accepted. And at that rally, and I'll just end by highlighting some of the things he said to kind of capture how he positioned himself in the struggle. And you see also the humanity of the Arch. So he spoke on our platform. This is launching the End Conscription campaign. And he makes the point first that the government needs to be commended for removing certain restrictions against Black people. So here's this man who's not entitled to vote as a citizen in his own country, who is commending the apartheid regime for having removed some of the most gross of the restrictions on Black people. Then he goes on to say unequivocally, we are not interested in reforms. We are not interested in toying with and playing with apartheid. He says the government itself is apartheid. He says you can't reform apartheid. You have to dismantle it. This is Frankenstein. You have to destroy it. So he's not mincing his words here. It's unequivocal. He also says that there are signs of hope. And this is a really difficult era in our history with immense repression and states of emergency, etc. He sees signs of hope. Where's the hope? He says, this is God's word and he's in charge. Even if you're tempted to whisper in his ear, why don't you make it a little more obvious? So there's Tutu the Joker. What's the sign of hope for him? The sign of hope is the fact that there are some young white South Africans who are refusing to join the apartheid army. And then he goes on to make a point about reconciliation. Even in this incredibly divided environment, he says, we can only be free together, Black and white. And then he ends by making the point that reconciliation requires justice. In other words, it's not just about Black and white people somehow being friends together. Reconciliation requires justice, and justice depends on the ending of apartheid.
The Arch became an Anglican priest in 1961. Ellen, as you've mentioned, Desmond attended King's College London the following year in 1962 and earned a bachelor's and master's degree in the discipline of theology from the college. Throughout his career, Desmond spoke warmly of his time at King's College. And in 2004, as you mentioned, he was a visiting professor of the college. In 2015, The Guardian published an article, Desmond Tutu intervenes over King's College London's refusal to divest. At that time, a demand from 1,400 staff and students to sell off King's fossils fuels meant investments was rejected by the university. The university said that it supports relationships with fossil fuel companies as long as they are open about any harm they might do, and that they are taking action to minimize this harm. In response, the Arch said, people of conscience need to break their ties with corporations financing the injustice of climate change. He went on to say, it is clear fossil fuel companies are not simply going to give up. They stand to make too much money. And then Mark Horowitz with the fossil-free King's College London campaign said, I hope that King's will listen to its most beloved alumnus and a man revered around the world as a moral voice. He may be able to remind King's that where they invest their money has ramifications beyond our campus. In just a few moments, I will ask you to provide us with an update on this chronicle. I think you have some very good news to share with us, news that made the Arch very proud. But Ellen, I think you will agree, this was Desmond Tutu. He spoke truth to power. He championed all that he believed was right. He advocated for those who were often unable to advocate for themselves. I want to invite you to talk about Desmond's moral voice that was heard around the world. How did that voice impact King's College? How has that voice impacted many of your students and faculty? A recent article said that he was beloved and honored by King's College. And I think this is important because, as I just said, he spoke out against the college over investment in fossil fuels, yet he was still loved. What made him so different? What made him so effective? His charm, his humor, his authenticity, his love, his faith. People who want to foster the integral human development of people worldwide, what can they learn from this great man?
I think all those things you just listed are part of what made him so impactful. And he definitely did love King's, and King's definitely loved and loves the Arch despite the challenges, maybe because of the challenges that he brought to us. Trevor Tutu, Desmond's son, actually sought me out in the cathedral in Cape Town just before the funeral started because he wanted to say how grateful he and the whole family were to King's for what it had given to the Arch, and kept actually speaking over me as I kept trying to say what an honor it was to be there. And he said, no, we're so thankful to King's. And I think it's really important for us as universities to remember what an impact we can make on our students, allowing those like the Arch who are already remarkable to grow into their full potential. And one of the things that we did just back in October was have a special service here to mark his 90th birthday, which was live streamed to the family home. And his sister said that this was one of the last things that he was able to fully engage with and enjoy before his final decline. And the thing that spoke to him most were the two undergraduate students from the theology department, one Christian, one Muslim, who talked about the impact it had on them following in his footsteps. And they talked about sort of his passion for inclusivity, his passion for justice, the ability he had to enable change, and his joyful embrace of life and of faith, and what a difference that made to them in sort of valuing their own faiths, both Christianity and Islam, and valuing the studies that they were doing. And you talked about Tutu's challenge to King's around disinvestment from fossil fuels. I'm very pleased to say that we did achieve full disinvestment in 2020, which was 2 years ahead of the schedule we set ourselves. So as you said, there was a movement within the university, staff and students who were speaking alongside Tutu, but his was definitely the most powerful and effective voice. And for those who didn't welcome his message, there's still such a great degree of respect and affection for him as a man. I think that one always got with him the sense that he was open to you and saw you as a beloved child of God, even if he passionately disagreed with your opinion on a particular subject. That joyful laugh and mischief stopped him taking himself too seriously and allowed people to sort of let down their own guard with him, which isn't to say that he couldn't be very passionate and make his opinions very strongly known. And one of the things that King's tries to value is to be true to its founding character as an institution which takes both faith and justice seriously. And that means that we should, and sometimes are able to be open to being called out when we're falling short of our own ideals. And that is something that we can, at least from people we respect as much as Tutu, welcome rather than resent. And you were asking, what can we all learn from him? I think that work for justice is faith in action and not an optional extra for people of faith. That love, courage, humility, humor, and passion are a combination that can change the world. And that having this love, courage, humility, humor, and passion may need the 2 hours of meditative prayer at the beginning of each day that Desmond Tutu took to root himself in the love of God, so that all of his activity, all of his work for change and justice didn't just come from him, but sprang from somewhere deeper and allowed him to be joyful and hopeful in the midst of the hardest of circumstances.
Thank you. A very authentic individual, a very human person, someone who, as you've already made mention of, truly spoke truth to power. He was very real. And I think when we think about interreligious dialogue, engaging with religious others, one of the things we need to truly remember is that when we go to that table, we need to bring all of ourselves. We need to be real. We need to be genuine. We need to exercise love for the other human that is sitting in front of us, but be real, deal with the issues at hand. But we can do that with respect. We can do that and continue to show dignity to all people present. Professor Laurie, racism. It's a real problem. Racism is ugly. Racism is evil. Nearly 2 years ago, your family and my family were walking together, and you and I particularly were talking about matters of race in South Africa and the United States. And I remember you telling me that if someone is anti-racist, then that person bears a burden to speak up, and a burden to speak out against racism. In other words, it is not good enough to simply say that racism is wrong. We need to have the courage to see, the courage to speak, and the courage to act. Desmond Tutu possessed that courage. Every one of you have made mention of that. Laurie, you possess that courage. Apartheid in South Africa was brought to its knees in large part due to Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, and people like you, and some people we will never hear of. The United States is struggling to rid itself of racism in all its many forms. What are some key takeaways from your work with and knowledge of Desmond in ending apartheid in South Africa that we can apply here at home to help end this racism?
Charles, thank you for the positive comments, but I think I would want to begin by saying that we haven't ended apartheid in South Africa. And I think the Arch would have been the first to proclaim that loudly. We ended a formal legalized system of discrimination against Black people, but the fundamental inequality in South Africa that was generated by and perpetuated by apartheid, by colonialism and then apartheid, is still real. It's still our lived reality in South Africa, where inequality between the wealthy and the poor is vast, and there is a coincidence of wealth, a correlation between wealth and so-called race. The vast majority of white people are well off, middle class, and have not really paid any significant price for being beneficiaries of apartheid, whereas the vast majority of Black people are poor and destitute. And so there's a lesson that we need to, that negative lesson we need to draw from South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy, not only the positive lesson. And the negative lesson is that while the physical and visible manifestations of overt racism are critically important to address, so is the underlying structural problem of structural racism, where embedded in society, in the US, as in South Africa, people of color, African Americans and other people of color are significantly prejudiced in every respect. And all the statistics and indicators demonstrate that unequivocally. So the struggle here in this country for racial justice is a struggle that has a long, long journey ahead of it. And it's in a way more challenging, more difficult than in South Africa, because in South Africa, as I said earlier, as we all know, the vast majority of South Africans were Black, and we knew that at the end of the day, we would prevail over a minority regime. We didn't know when, but we had no doubt that we would win the day eventually and establish a system whereby all people had at least formally the right to vote. The challenge in the US, where oppressed people and exploited people are people of color, is a much more difficult challenge. And my call to those that are part of the Notre Dame community is that we have to look at our own home. So, you know, it's one thing at the Keough School of Global Affairs and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies to have a global focus, great. But we also have to look at our own home. And our own home is the University of Notre Dame and the community of South Bend. And both of those institutions have a long way to go before they achieve anything remotely like racial justice. And so if we say that we are committed to racial justice and committed to honoring the legacy of Archbishop Tutu, then we need to put that commitment into action here at home.
Thank you. Imam Omar. In 2006, the book Tutu as I Know Him on a Personal Note was published. You contributed to this book by writing a chapter titled A Symbol of Peace. You wrote that in 2003, you were instrumental in inviting the Arch to offer the keynote address for a conference being held here at the University of Notre Dame. The conference was titled Peacebuilding After Peace Accords. In this chapter, you spoke of the life-changing impact Tutu's witness of peace and compassion has had on the lives of ordinary citizens around the world. Also, you included a comment by one of your students from Kenya that really struck me. The student said, "I was impressed when he, Desmond, said when people dehumanize others, they also dehumanize themselves. As peace builders, we might tend to side with the victims. But it is important that we find a way to reach out to the oppressors as well. We need to include them in the healing." I think this is a very timely and crucial conversation that needs to be had in America today. So please take a few moments and unpack this comment for us, as well as speak to the life-changing impact Tutu's witness of peace and compassion has had on the lives of ordinary citizens around the world. Tell us in what ways.
Thank you, Charles. As you indicated that I wrote this chapter. In fact, it was in honor of Tutu's 75th birthday in 2006, and they'd asked me to write a chapter. And I was thinking long and hard about my many interactions with the Arch. And the only time that I ever met him outside of South Africa was this time when I invited him to deliver a keynote address at a conference organized here by the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame. And of course, you know, as part of the lecture, which was a rousing address, it was, you know, another icon at the University of Notre Dame that you probably would know, the late Father Ted Hesburgh was present at this, you know, lecture, and he used to say that this was a special Notre Dame moment. And for those of us who are at Notre Dame, we know what that actually means. And the quote from our Kenyan students after the lecture, we had Archbishop Tutu meeting with some of the students, and they were just overwhelmed by this wonderful opportunity, and he really interacted with the students in a very powerful way. And so the quote from the Kenyan student that you refer to is a very profound quote, and I think it symbolizes the theology of peace building and reconciliation of Tutu. Tutu firmly believed that when some people oppress and commit atrocities against others, they not only dehumanize their victims, but they also dehumanize themselves. They become lesser humans. So for Tutu, part of a genuine process of reconciliation was that not only victims should be healed, but also perpetrators need to embark on a journey of healing to rehumanize themselves. Now, this process of reconciliation not only included deep forgiveness, but also restitution. Now, you know, many of us, of course, know that the Archbishop wrote this wonderful book called No Reconciliation Without Forgiveness. That is one of his magnum opuses, his books, which came out of his reflections of the Truth Commission. However, you know, Tutu's forgiveness was not a cheap forgiveness. He was also a strong advocate of restorative justice and restitution. And I would like to conclude here by an analogy. Tutu was very good in simplifying things. So he had introduced the notion of bicycle theology. So what is bicycle theology? So he would give the story that, you know, if someone stole your bicycle in a moment of madness, and 6 months or a year later, you know, he has some kind of epiphany, he feels very guilty, and so he comes to you and admits that I am the one who stole your bike. And I'm very sorry that I stole your bicycle. Of course, you're overwhelmed because why would this person want to acknowledge it? And so you find it deep within yourself to forgive this person who is confessing, you know, and asking your forgiveness. And this is a wonderful story. But for Tutu then, the problem with this kind of reconciliation was, where is the bike? Where is the bicycle? So restitution, according to Tutu, requires that the perpetrator should also try his best to return the bike or to compensate in some way for, the owner for the loss of his bicycle. And it's only after such a form of reconciliation and restitution that true forgiveness is possible. So in summary, for Tutu, reconciliation demands not only the personal processes of confession and forgiveness, but also structural and institutional changes, which we are, of course, back in South Africa, still struggling with. And this was also contained in the profound message, and I want to conclude here, that Tutu delivered at the University of Notre Dame in 2003, almost 2 decades ago. And I want to quote this. The full text, of course, of his address is part of a foreword of a book published by the University of Notre Dame Press, called Peacebuilding After Peace Accords. So this is what he said, and I conclude with this. I quote, "In our Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, we declared that unless the gap between the rich and the poor and the have-nots was not reduced drastically, we could just as well kiss reconciliation goodbye. In many ways, we are sitting on a powder keg," unquote. What prophetic words. Thank you for your patience with me.
I really appreciate all three of you and how you have contributed to this conversation, coming at it from many different angles. Audience, if there are any questions that you would like to ask, please submit them at this time. Otherwise, I invite my esteemed panelists, if you might like to take a few moments and ask each other a few questions, or maybe some thoughts additionally that you would like to share at this time. We have a few minutes more here.
If I can just say briefly, Charles, that I think there are two myths about Tutu that I would want to dispel. The first myth is that he was an entirely pacific, benevolent, loving character. And he was those things, but Tutu was also a revolutionary. Tutu was a militant revolutionary, and he fought in a non-violent way for the ending of apartheid with enormous courage. Not only moral courage, but physical courage. When we were demonstrating in the streets, Tutu was at the head of the demonstration, not at the back of the demonstration. And the second myth was that Tutu was anti-Semitic. And that myth arises because he took a clear and unequivocal stand on Palestine, the Israeli government's occupation of Palestine, and equated that situation with apartheid South Africa and called for the liberation of Palestine. And so for conservative Jewish people, the charge of anti-Semite arose. I grew up in a Jewish background. I worked closely with Tutu when Jewish young men were conscientious objectors, and we could not find a rabbi to testify on their behalf. In court, we looked to Archbishop Tutu and other church leaders. So those of us who knew and worked with him regarded as a scurrilous canard to see him as an anti-Semite. What is the lesson of Tutu? The lesson is human dignity is universal, and we need to fight for human dignity wherever it is compromised.
Imam Omar, you experienced this firsthand working with him. I wonder if you might have any further comments.
Absolutely. As I said at the beginning, I mean, there would be a tendency for us to and of course, it's correct to, paint Tutu as this wonderful human being. Of course, he was wonderful, but also he has a sharp edge. I remember when Tony Blair visited Cape Town, and Tutu had been scheduled to share a platform with him, and Tutu then refused and publicly went on record as saying that Tony Blair and George W. Bush need to account for the illegitimate, unjust war in Iraq at the International Criminal Court. Of course, that's not going to make him popular in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but that's basically what Tutu was. He was courageous and unafraid to speak his mind. In fact, he suffered a lot, not only being called an anti-Semite or senile. When his good friend, his closest friend, the late President Nelson Mandela, passed away, I think it was in 2013, because of Tutu's criticism of the African National Party government, they did not invite him to the funeral of Mandela. And subsequently, there was a scramble. people felt embarrassed, and so they persuaded the government to issue a late invitation. And so when they went to speak to the archbishop, of course, it was difficult to persuade him, right? Because he had been slighted. Imagine his close friend Mandela, he is not invited to his funeral, and this is what he suffered as a result of having, courageously, witnessing to justice. May his soul rest in peace.
Amen. Ellen, any concluding comments?
Just one thing, I think that he would want us to remember that he didn't work in isolation, that Mama Leah, his beloved wife and now widow, was part of enabling him to be all that he could be. And I think he would want us to acknowledge her alongside him.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Esteemed orators, thank you for your participation on this panel. You have given us much to think about and to act upon. I wish you well in your peacemaking and bridge building endeavors. Audience, thank you for your interest in the life and legacy of Desmond Tutu. Thank you for the good work you are doing in fostering the integral human development of all people. I finally want to say that this panel has been brought to you by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion and co-sponsored by the University of Notre Dame's African Student Association, the Keough Center for Civil and Human Rights, and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. All of us at the Ansari Institute, thank you for joining us, and join us next time. Until then, I'm Charles Powell. Goodbye.